Welcome to Series 2.4 about wisdom, the virtue. Wisdom, also known in ancient Greece as Sophia. The extracts on wisdom are on page 6 of Folio B. Let's first recall what Socrates says about the virtue wisdom, and then we'll review what Aristotle teaches us, and finally I'll add some insights we've discovered in Philosophy 225 over the recent years. Recall what Socrates says about wisdom. Socrates was reputed to be wise, so everybody believed most people believed Socrates was wise, and he tells us he knew he didn't have this virtue, wisdom. Socrates knows also that everyone he's ever examined has failed to have wisdom. Why? Because he asked really good questions about matters they claimed to know about, and they could not answer his questions, says Socrates. Socrates concluded, none of us is wise, only the God is wise. Socrates also hints that he knows roughly the area of wisdom, or what the knowledge is that wisdom's about. Wisdom must be about the gods. It must be about the afterlife. A person who's wise would know about the very end of life and what happens there. And Socrates also hints that a person who is wise is a person who can teach and impart virtue. He tells us those are all the areas that people ascribe to him, and he doesn't do any of those things, he says. So in short, for Socrates, wisdom is about all great important matters that we humans are ignorant about. Well, that's different from what Aristotle tells us. For Aristotle, wisdom is one of 4 virtues of thought. Recall that there are virtues of character, which are virtues enabling me to perform worldly actions. And on the other side, there are virtues of thought. In other words, virtues of the mind, of thinking activities. And Aristotle distinguishes 4 virtues of thought: prudence, science, or also translated as insight, sense, sometimes translated as understanding, and finally wisdom. I'll run over those for you. Prudence, we've already mentioned the virtues of character. In fact, prudence is sometimes listed under both categories of virtue. It is a bridge virtue, both a virtue of character and an intellectual virtue. Science or insight is the virtue for those who practice judging and evaluating and diagnosing, like physical bodies or artificial things like cars. So a person who's an expert needs this virtue to do those activities well. Sense or understanding for Aristotle is that virtue all of us all the time use whenever we simply grasp the meaning of something, like a word, an object on the ground, somebody walking toward me. All the time, in a kind of blink of an eye, we form quick grasps of the world around us. In fact, that's a good general definition of what a virtue of thought is. A virtue of thought is a virtue enabling me to grasp truths, and there are different kinds of truths. Finally, there is wisdom, which Aristotle calls the supreme virtue, so the most important of the virtues. And this is a virtue which enables me to grasp, I'm quoting from Aristotle, extraordinary, amazing, difficult, and divine truths. So you can distinguish the 4 intellectual virtues in terms of the area of truth that it grasps and discovers. For Aristotle, if I have wisdom, then I contemplate well. If I lack wisdom, then I will contemplate poorly. Aristotle distinguishes wisdom from prudence, because we often confuse the two, and he also distinguishes wisdom and what he calls crafts knowledge, which is like what architects and farmers have when they perform their activities. Some people confuse wisdom with like the practical knowledge of a farmer. Wisdom, as I've mentioned, is the supreme virtue, and Aristotle has very simple insights about it. And one thing he doesn't talk about is what are the bad versions of wisdom, the deficiency of wisdom and the excess of wisdom. Aristotle says nothing about this. St. Thomas Aquinas, 130 years later, 1,500 years later, states that all of the virtues of thought, like the virtues of character, have extremes, a deficiency and an excess. And on my study, it's very useful to know those extremes in order to have an insight about a virtue like wisdom. So one conclusion I've had as the Philosophy 225 instructor is about the extremes of this virtue, wisdom. And I've discovered that superstition is the undeveloped or deficient form of wisdom. A person who is superstitious is a person who, when they behold a amazing truth, perhaps a miracle, or perhaps like a master painting, or perhaps an event in life that is beyond ordinary comprehension. Ordinarily, as an undeveloped wise person, I take that as being about me, as being important and like a sign of some kind. Well, the person who's wise doesn't take supernatural events as being personal, as being just about them. Instead, they have a kind of understanding that a supernatural event is just the beginning of the truth about this phenomena, that there's more to learn, and that one should be patient and open-minded and expect more truth. So that's one insight we've had about the virtue wisdom. Aristotle thinks it's the human function to contemplate. So it must be true that all of us by nature practice contemplating. And one important conclusion I've had is that when we go to museums and we view sculptures and master paintings, or when we go to performances and we see world-class performers, actors, musicians, when we visit world sites important in history, for example, the Acropolis in Athens, on such occasions, we may be practicing contemplation, a kind of thoughtful, pondering, open-mindedness about realities that may require a whole life to think about. Well, I think that's a good place to stop our series 2, and I'd like to prepare an extra series about our dialogue for those who would like further guidance in preparation for September 30th, the submission day. I hope to see you soon.